The sky was a deep, late evening blue when Pintel returned above deck. He hoped it was only because he and Ragetti had gone down to the crew's quarters right at the cusp of evening, and not because he'd been wallowing down there for hours on end when he should have been working. The last thing he wanted to do was mark himself as a problem alongside Ragetti in Higgins's mind. Fortunately, there were no scoldings waiting for him on deck. Most of the crew seemed to be winding down for the night, including Higgins, and they all seemed content just to be done with the hardest part of the day. The men who weren't trimming the sails or tying off the last tack lines were already lazing beside the rails with smatters of laughter as they talked amongst themselves. Pintel didn't see Ragetti anywhere. That probably meant his comrade was on night watch up in the crow's nest, or maybe the kid was just avoiding him again. Pintel sidled up to a pair of deckhands who were coiling ropes, and he set to work helping them. Maybe he could get a few shipmates to second-guess his absence if he looked busy enough now. He kept up his pitiful ruse for just a few minutes before a voice called down from the crow's nest. "Sail ho!" Every head on deck tilted up towards the lookout, including Pintel's. The man alerting them from that platform atop the mainmast wasn't Ragetti. "What are her colors?" Higgins shouted back up from the helm. "The company's! She's coming in off our stern like she means to pull alongside us, Captain!" Pintel's stomach dropped. Higgins didn't seem much happier. "All hands to the bow and drop anchor," he ordered in his clear, firm tone. "Prepare for inspection!" It took 3 crewmen bumping into Pintel to jar him back to his senses. He scanned the freshly bustling crowd until he spotted the ship's third mate. Then he hurried to the man. He needed to talk to someone who had answers, but not too much authority for comfort. "Mr. Braddock?" he asked as calmly as he could. "What's going on?" "Company overseers are checking in," the younger fellow said with a shrug. "They'll only be an hour or 2 once they board us." Pintel stifled every impulse to repeat those last words in horror. Right. Wouldn't want to inconvenience no one." He turned away and squinted nervously up past the quarterdeck. The white sails of the trading company's ship were taking shape in the darkness behind the Canterbury, looking like a school of ghostly pale manta rays emerging from the depths. Even Captain Higgins seemed to be glancing back at the foreboding sight more than he was facing forward. "She's moving to board our starboard side," he informed the crew. "Be ready!" A loud splash sounded from ahead as their anchor hit the waves. Pintel gulped and scanned his crewmates again. He still couldn't find Ragetti. "It's just an inspection," he told himself in his head. "They're here for the cargo, not for the crew. No reason to fret." "They brand pirates," his thoughts retorted. "You don't think they're gonna pay a little attention to the crew? A tall tale from a salesman, that's all that was. Just like the tall tale about them boarding ships." Where was Ragetti? Pintel's heart was beating faster by the minute. What could he do? Should he try hiding below deck before the inspectors came aboard? Should he stay up here and try to blend in with the other sailors? Should he start plotting another escape? Where was Ragetti? "Jones?" Pintel called out shakily. "Jonesy?" It was either his ship-jumper's instinct or something even more intuitive that made him pace the deck and look down over the Canterbury's side rails. The ship boasted a dozen longboats, and they hung suspended like wooden hammocks in a line along each of the mother vessel's flanks. One longboat on her port side was missing. Pintel bit his knuckle to hold in a scream. He stumbled back from the rail and kept searching the deck. It couldn't be true. He was just panicking. Ragetti wouldn't bail out like that in the middle of the sea, and especially not here. The lad didn't even want to go to Pelagosto. And yet, the last words they'd spoken to each other still echoed chillingly through Pintel's head. "Where you going?" "Where I wants to go!" "Jonesy?" Pintel was almost whimpering with dread. "Rags!" He halted when another idea suddenly seized him. He started looking down then. "Poochie! Poochie! Where are you, boy? Pinners needs a trail sniffer." Could the little key-keeper track a scent? Probably. All dogs could, right? And Pintel had enough of his and Ragetti's gear below deck to use as references for the canine. Or did he? Pintel stopped and gaped at the stairwell entrance. What if Ragetti... He was down the first set of stairs in a flash. "Jonesy!" The crew's quarters were still empty. The pirate went straight to the row of hammocks where his and Ragetti's hung. Then he dropped to one knee by a stack of crates against the nearest wall. That was where the two of them had hidden their weapons and the rest of their gear. He reached behind the crates, cringing at the sounds of his shipmates' footsteps thundering overhead, and felt around for that canvas bundle. It wasn't there. Pintel's heart nearly jumped into his throat. Then his whole body nearly jumped to the ceiling when he felt two hands grab his arm. "Come on!" the other man hissed while hoisting him up. Pintel was astounded. "Rags!" There he was, tall, scrawny, blond, and still on board. He didn't meet the elder's eye, but he did practically haul him back to the stairwell. Was that a good sign? "I already got everything," Ragetti said urgently, not angrily. "We gotta go now." Questions were mounting by the dozen in Pintel's head, but he kept his mouth shut and followed along. We. Rags had said we. They took the stairs farther down this time. That brought them to the Canterbury's gun deck, a chamber just as spacious as the crew's quarters, but with a row of cannons and firing portals along each wall. None of those massive wheeled guns looked like it had ever been used for its intended purpose. Pintel hoped Ragetti wasn't planning to change that tonight. He breathed half a sigh of relief when the youngster elbowed past one of the cannons and stooped to peek out through its portal. The rest of his sigh cut off when he spied a rope line leading out through that same portal and realized what Ragetti was planning instead. His accomplice withdrew and wheeled the cannon back a few inches to make more room. "The boat's still out there. Got everything in it. You goes first." Pintel went whiter than any sail. "Out the portal?" "Those East India blighters is on the ship's starboard side. They won't seize you." That was when the last of the footsteps on deck went silent. Both outlaws froze and stared up at the ceiling for a moment. Ragetti tapped Pintel's arm then as a signal to go. The shorter man took that to heart and wriggled through the exit feet first. Just as he'd guessed, the missing longboat was tethered to the ship by the rope line and bobbing on the waves 15 feet below. Along with that rope, Ragetti had left 2 footholds leading down to the boat in the form of 2 knives that he'd plunged deep into the ship's side. One of them was the lad's own carving knife. Pintel had a hunch the other had belonged to Scratch, another of their late Black Pearl crewmates. As soon as Pintel sat down on one of the longboat's benches, a furry gray mass landed heavily in his lap. The pirate flailed in confusion and leaned back for a better view of his load. He never knew a dog's face could look judgmental until he found Poochie glaring straight back at him. "I was looking for you two," Pintel insisted. Ragetti clambered down after them like a spider monkey and pulled out the knives as he went. Once he took his own seat aboard the longboat, he cut loose the rope line and pushed off from the ship with one of his long, skinny legs. Each man took up an oar and quietly started rowing. Minutes later, they saw the white sails of that company ship looming ominously over the far side of the Canterbury trader. They didn't let that throw off their pace. They knew they were already too far away to be spotted in the night. Pintel kept his gaze on those sails until they also faded safely into the darkness. Then he turned to Ragetti with a grin. The other man didn't return it. He didn't even seem aware that Pintel was seated next to him, let alone that his partner's eyes were on him. He just kept up his rowing with a blank, downcast gaze. A lifeless gaze. Pintel's grin wilted. Then he somberly faced the darkness again. It was easy enough for a long-time schemer to guess how Ragetti had pulled off their latest escape. It wasn't so easy to guess why he'd done it, though, or why he seemed so despondent in the wake of it. That mysteriousness wasn't from a lack of theories on Pintel's part. It was because the older fugitive was afraid to put those theories into words. Rags was as empty and faded now as he'd been the day they deserted the Navy, almost like he'd resigned himself to another hopelessly awful existence. They rowed all night and most of the next day. Around late afternoon, they spotted a tall rock pillar in the distance and followed it to a small island. It wasn't Pelagosto, but it wasn't far from there. Ragetti said he knew that because he'd stolen several peeks at Higgins's navigation charts throughout their brief time aboard the Canterbury. Even on his worst days, the lad was a natural pirate. Pintel had a feeling it wasn't a compliment Ragetti wanted to hear, though. They made another campsite on the island. This landmass had rockier terrain than most others of its size in the Caribbean, but the pair found a stretch of beach that was sandy enough for them to bring their longboat ashore and sit comfortably. They had even less trouble gathering firewood from the sparse jungle that took up most of the island's middle. Once everything was in place, Pintel collected Poochie and his fishing gear and started hiking back up the dunes towards the trees. He paused as they passed Ragetti.
"Rags,"
he said with care,
"I'm gonna try catching us some dinner. It looks like better fishing on the far side of the island. You can come along if you wants."
"Someone should stay with the camp," the other replied as he continued arranging the woodpile. He sounded as emotionless as he looked, and he kept his eyes down. His comrade nodded and pointed up over the trees anyway.
"Aye, well, if you changes your mind, I'll be next to that big rock pillar over there."
Ragetti bobbed his head in turn. Pintel made himself proceed up the dunes then. It probably wasn't the best idea to leave the kid alone in such a state, but Rags clearly needed the privacy, and showing him some trust in the meantime couldn't hurt, right? Pintel reached the jungle and went traipsing back through it. He was glad at least to see Poochie trailing him closely with a wagging tail again. The sound of those keys jingling from the dog's muzzle also chased some of the fog from the bald man's mind, and that allowed him to glance around at the scenery. That was how he came to notice the dashes of orange among one tree's branches to his right. Pintel stopped and gave the tree a curious squint. It wasn't especially tall. In fact, its lowest branches were so close to the ground that it looked more like an enormous bush. The dashes of orange looked to be large pieces of fruit, but the nearest ones seemed to have patches of green on their smooth skin, too. It wasn't until he walked up to them and inspected the bunch that he realized what he'd found. Mangoes! He stepped back in surprise. That couldn't be what they were. And yet they had that same shape, size, color, and aroma that he knew. They were the same characteristics he'd seen and smelled a million times back in Kingston. The same ones Ragetti had probably seen and smelled a million times more. Pintel looked back towards the campsite, then he set down his fishing gear and grabbed one of those orange and green treasures. It squished and split open in his hand before he even pulled it free. He let go of it with a sound of disgust and jumped back from the shower of juice. Then he glared at the mango again. Stringy brown pulp jutted from its wounds. Pintel squared his jaw and seized another mango. When that ended just as badly, he tried the other 4 specimens in the bunch. Each one gave him the same nasty, soggy results. They were all bloody rotten! The pirate almost bent down to grab his fishing gear and storm off, but he stopped himself. He sent a more meaningful glance back towards the campsite. Then he cooled and moved to the next cluster of mangoes. He tested 100 of them if he tested one. He even managed to climb up onto a few boulders in the tree's absolute lowest branches to reach more fruit. The ground below him was a sticky, sweet-smelling bog of juice before long, but in the end, it was worth it. An hour after he found that tree, Pintel was marching triumphantly back down to the beach with a perfectly firm, perfectly ripe mango in his hand. Ragetti was rubbing 2 sticks together in an effort to light the campfire when that prize fruit was placed on a rock beside him. He actually did a double take and sat up to stare at it. "Where'd you get that?" he asked flatly.
"There's a whole tree full of 'em right up the hill over there,"
Pintel said proudly with a nod to the dunes.
"We must have been too busy to see it before."
"But mangoes don't grow in the Caribbean."
"Neither the underground storehouse is full of rum, but I found one of those in these parts not too long ago. Someone probably planted that tree up there to harvest and sell their own mangoes someday."
Ragetti blandly picked up the fruit, already feeling for the pit's edges. "You wants me to cut it up for dinner?" Pintel waved it away.
"Nah, that's yours. You're the one's always had a taste for 'em."
The younger man paused, then nodded and set the mango back on the rock. "Thanks." He turned away from his gift and resumed rubbing his sticks together. Pintel frowned. He wasn't sure what kind of a reaction he'd expected from his friend, but it hadn't been that. A part of him wanted to get angry at the lack of gratitude, but he was suddenly having as much trouble igniting his temper as Ragetti was having with that woodpile. Mostly he just felt disappointed, like he'd failed his boy again somehow. He shouldered his fishing gear and turned away. He was about to start up the dunes yet again when he saw Poochie watching him from the top. Something about the way the dog stood back like that with those keys dangling from his mouth made Pintel hesitate. For a second, he felt like he and Ragetti were back in their jail cell in Port Royal. Ragetti hadn't been this withdrawn in prison. He'd been worse. Besides the whimpers of pain, the only sounds he'd made after his beating on that first night had been angry growls whenever Pintel had tried to approach him. The poor lad had stayed huddled under the bench in their cell's darkest corner with wild, frantic eyes for 3 days. But on the 4th, he'd emerged with a book in his hand, in a far more mindful demeanor. By the 5th day, he'd started talking again. Something in that cell had given him peace of mind, and it hadn't been his cellmate.
"Rags,"
Pintel called softly. The youngster put down his fire sticks.
"What?"
The elder swallowed in thought, then he gestured down at the mango.
"Maybe that's a miracle."
Ragetti turned and blinked up at him. Pintel gave a lame shrug in return, not quite believing he'd said such a thing either. Then he headed up to the jungle once more. Pintel wasn't out fishing for long. The year of practice had taught him a few tricks, and with how many sea bass there were along the shore by the island's rock pillar, the angling odds were finally in his favor. He caught a bass the length of his forearm within an hour, and promptly began his victory stroll with it back to the campsite. He took the longer route this time, just so he could take off his boots and walk along the sandier parts of the beach with Poochie while the tides came in. The waves rushing over his feet were bone-chillingly cold at first, but the more times he weathered them, the warmer they felt. The old curmudgeon was almost wading through the water like a heron by the time he spotted their campsite on the horizon. The fire still wasn't lit. Ragetti must have given up on it, because he was now sitting closer to the water with his back to the woodpile. He was hunched over with his knees bent up slightly in front of him, and resting on top of them, already with a slice visibly missing, was the mango. Try as he might, Pintel couldn't hold back his smugness. He stepped out of the water with a smirk and approached more quietly, trying to think of a witty remark to make when he reached his pal. All of that went out the door the minute he got within earshot of Ragetti. That was when he heard the sobs. Pintel froze with gaping eyes. He wasn't mistaken. He could see the younger man rocking back and forth now. He could see the quivering shoulders, and the hand that kept pressing to Ragetti's mouth and wiping at his eyes, and that mango with the piece cut out of it. Pintel started to run to his comrade. Damn that tree and all those mushy, good-for-nothing balls of fly bait hanging from it. He should have known there'd still be something wrong even with the one he'd picked. Pintel was 50 feet from the campsite when he saw Ragetti lift his knife. Then he saw the kid cut another slice from the mango. Pintel halted again, confounded. Rags sniffled to himself, took a bite from the new slice, and covered his crumpled red face with another heart-wrenching sound. Pintel stood helpless on the beach for a minute until the truth began to set in. Once it did, he needed every ounce of his strength to step away from his boy. Poochie ventured past him, not understanding. Pintel summoned the dog back to him with a faint but heavy whisper.
No, leave him be, Poochie. Let's go this way. Rags needs a little more time to sort things out."
Ragetti was still oblivious to their presence. They should have been close enough for him to spot them, but they were on his right side, his blind side. Pintel took that bittersweet luck for what it was and turned to head back to his fishing spot. All the while, he kept one eye forlornly on his friend over his shoulder and reminded himself why he needed to keep walking away. Let the lad remember. Let him mourn. Let him be relieved. Let him feel everything now. And let him do it without his miserable excuse for an uncle there to get in the way.